How do you reduce or even prevent compaction on your farm? Well, there's a lot that goes into that. Today, we're just going to talk about one big aspect, and that is deep tillage. We get lots of questions about this each year.
There are a number of different ways to do deep tillage. You can certainly turn all the soil over and really start over again. But to me, there are some inherent risks with that. Your ground could be super soft next spring. You're more prone to erosion, and the list goes on and on. What I really prefer to do is use a straight shank and just cut through those compaction layers without turning everything over. This is a process that we call zone building because we're really doing tillage just in certain zones, and then ideally we'll plant right over those zones so our roots have really no distraction as they go down, no disturbance. They can just head right on down through the compacted layers and get deep in our soil.
All right, so just to go back to what Darren originally said in that turning over or rolling over of soil, the big thing that concerns me is now you're bringing your subsoil up and that becomes a topsoil. And eventually that's all fine. Over a 30-year, 50-year process, you can turn it all into topsoil if you want with an awful lot of work. But if we're trying to farm this year or this next year and we want the very best crop, it's usually not a real great idea to bring your subsoil up and put that on your topsoil, especially if you're going down, let's say, 10 inches, 12 inches, 14 inches deep. So what we would rather see you do is, like Darren said, kind of leave that soil mostly in place, but that said, we do know that there are compaction layers below ground. What we would first suggest you do is identify where the compaction layers are at on your farm. If you've done the same type of tillage over the years, or let's say you've been no-till for 15 years, just go out there and start digging around, start poking around a little bit, and you'll learn a lot. What Darren likes to do a lot of times is just go out there with a rod or a spade or something like that and just poke down as he goes throughout the field. What I personally like is digging a couple of root pits around the farm, and then I have a visual idea of what's really been happening for quite a while. What I'm getting at here is if I dig a 4-foot deep pit, and let's call it 10 feet wide, I can really see where my roots have been growing, what the different colors are in soil, and I can also take a knife into the side of that pit and just run that knife upward, and a lot of times I'll find a shallow compaction layer at somewhere in the range of 4 to 8 inches deep, and a deeper compaction layer that's often in the 10 to 18 inch range. So ideally, what we'd like to do is go below both levels of compaction if at all possible. Once you've identified where your deepest level of compaction is at, that's the target that we're shooting for. So let's say it's 18 inches, you'd like to be down at 19 or 20 inches deep when you're running some type of deep tillage out there to bust up all the compaction.
Kind of a happy medium of how to find those compaction layers. I like to use a post hole digger, then you can just reach your arm in and do the same thing Brian's talking about. But when he's talking about running a knife up through there, I'd like that knife blade to be at least 3 or 4 inches long so you do get some resistance as you hit those zones. And if you're getting resistance with yourself pulling a knife through, imagine a tiny little root system trying to get through those compacted layers. It's a big deal. So we want to get those addressed out on the farm. And you think about, well, what about that deep one? What's it really stopping me from? Hey, if you get in an extended drought, like this year in central Illinois, a place that you would think, oh, they get rain all the time in Illinois. No, they went a month without any rain in some areas of Illinois. Well, that's a big time drought for there. And if you went down in the soil, you could go down in the top 14, 16 inches, and it's really dry. So you do want to make sure that you're getting through that lower level of compaction as well, so your roots can get down to the moisture, but also so moisture is free to come back up in your soil.
It's very possible that you could have roots going down 4 to 6 feet deep with many different crops once you break up these compaction layers. But another thing I'll go back to that Darren said earlier is making your soil really soft. If you do full-scale tillage and just completely eliminate the compaction layers, well, next spring, if it's a little bit damp, or even if it's not, it's possible that you might start sinking a little bit in your field. That's not real great either. So what we like with these straight shanks and narrow points and going every 30 inches is now in between those spots, in between those slots we'll call them, we still have a relatively firm base. We've done this many times in the past, dug root pits the year later, and we found that roots will find those slots. So roots will figure out, well, let's face it, they don't figure anything out. They just grow based on taking the path of least resistance. Well, where's the least resistance? It's where we've eliminated the compaction. So you'll find roots, if you start digging around, that start migrating over to those areas, and then they'll go down through those prior compacted zones in the slots.
The other question you may have is, how often do you have to do this? Is this something you have to do every year? No, you definitely don't have to do it every year. We've got a lot of fields where we've gone out every 30 inches, built a zone like that, come back a year or a couple years later, moved over halfway in between those zones, done it again. And that's been the last time we've touched that ground, other than some strip tillage, which is done at a much shallower depth. Other fields where they're more compaction prone, maybe it's some low ground that's wetter, those types of things.
Or where we drive a lot, like on the end rows.
Sure. Some of those areas, we have to be in there a little bit more often. So you just have to make those determinations on your farm. The other thing is controlling traffic patterns, and that's why we're talking about this right in the middle of harvest, and for some, right at the beginning of corn harvest. If you're going to be driving big, heavy grain carts out there and trucks out into the field, control where that traffic goes. If you're just driving everywhere you want, willy-nilly out in the middle of the field, well, you're going to have compaction all over the place, and those are patterns that are going to show up with your satellite imagery or your aerial maps or whatever the case may be. They're going to show up for many years down the road.
Well, again, there are a lot of things we could talk about when it comes to compaction. The biggest thing that we wanted to cover today is, yes, there is a way to not necessarily eliminate compaction, but to work with the compaction that you've got out there to get roots deeper. We call it zone building. Some people just call it deep tillage with a straight shank narrow point.
One other problem we see out in fields right now is our weed of the week. We'll show you how to control it later in the show.